weather change.
Alright. Have we got enough battery on it?
It's on the
Yesterday it was supposed to be like
second. So I think it should be good. This one's been good ever since we had it.
The new battery is old in the charge book.
Alright. It says chapter 8 in the new book, it's chapter 9. So we're going to look at our major food groups: carbs, proteins, fats. We need to look at vitamins, minerals, and water. So today we're going to look at carbohydrates and maybe start protein. See how far we get. So if you use information from the American Dietetic Association, their ratios for carbs to proteins to fats are a little bit different to some other, the CDC. I think that their protein ratio is a little high for the ADA, but the reason that they give a continuum is to try to allow for a wide range of people. All right, so just because they give you an upper limit on these macronutrients that's quite high doesn't mean you have to go there. All right, they're trying to produce guidelines that are applicable to everybody. So then you've got to be clever as to where within the continuum do you place yourself or your student or your client, whoever you're working with. All right. So carbohydrates provide 4 kilocalories per gram. And the recommendation is anywhere from 45 to 65% of your calorie intake. Typically then, for most individuals, you're going to be looking at around 50% of your calorie intake should be carbohydrate if you're somewhat active. Right? So if you're just a typical adult who does some exercise, some physical activity to be healthy, then somewhere around 50% of your intake should be carbs. Right? And look at the big picture. Try not to micromanage. I don't like to encourage people to get so detailed that they're looking at every single meal, right? If you're a competitive athlete at a high level, that's a different kettle of fish. But for the typical person, I should look across a week, right? Do I have days where my fat content is way too high based on the ratio? Yes. Is it way too high every day of the week? No. Right? So try to, if you're not working with high-level athletes, try to be reasonable about how you use these guidelines. Right? So 45 to 50, around 50% for most people. Endurance athletes or anyone who's training on a regular basis is going to need quite a bit more carbohydrate than that. The RDA, so the number that you would see on the little food grid on an item that you're buying at the supermarket, is 300 grams. I am not personally a big fan of this RDA thing because this is one number. It doesn't allow for the difference between Naima and Dominique, right? Do Naima and Dominique both need 300 grams of carbohydrate a day? This seems a little ridiculous to me. However, right, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that's not my preference. When I'm thinking about it and I'm trying to personally organize my nutritional intake and be healthy, I don't pay any attention to this number. Not, at least not for carbs. But that's my personal bias, right? High glycemic carbohydrates. So items that are on a high glycemic index, white bread, candy, those kinds of carbohydrates you want to be careful about anyway. They can be quite useful if you need an immediate sugar fix because you've not eaten properly during the day and your blood sugar is dropping. You want to be a little bit careful about at any point giving your bloodstream a quick fix of glucose if you can avoid it, because the higher your insulin response, the less likely you are to use that glucose for storage, right? It's going to get moved into the muscle tissue or organs straight away, and then if you're not moving and you're at rest and you spike your blood sugar because you eat candy, then you're more likely to put that carbohydrate, that glucose spike down as fat than you are as glycogen. So be careful how you use items like that. We have, we've talked about the fact that we use carbohydrate to fuel anaerobic glycolysis. So I have to have either glucose or glycogen available to use system 2 to make ATP. And we also use the result of system 2 to fuel system 3 under certain circumstances. Right? So if I'm working aerobically, doesn't mean I don't use carbs. What ratio of carb to fat am I using depends on how hard I'm working. Right? So when we look at using carbohydrate for aerobic activity, it's highly beneficial to use carbohydrate at certain points. If I'm trying to run at a fast pace at the end of a race to pick up my time for the race, for example. All right? The higher the intensity, once I'm over 60–65% of my VO2 max, then I'm using predominantly carbohydrate to fuel aerobic work. So if I'm working with an elite athlete who's running an entire marathon at way higher than 65%, they're going to be using a lot of carbohydrate, where someone like me, who is going to walk a marathon or at least only jog sections of it, I'm going to use a lot more fat as an energy source to fuel a marathon. Right? So it really depends on the intensity of the work. But carbs are very useful. Right? I can sustain a faster race pace if I have plenty of carbohydrate available. So as long as I've got carbohydrate available, I can go a little bit quicker because I can make ATP faster. Remember the size of the molecule. Those fat molecules are massive. They're great. They contain loads of energy, but they take a long time to break down. So if I can get at carbohydrate, I can make ATP faster. If I'm using carbohydrate for a long period of time, though, then I'm going to start running out of not just my muscle glycogen stores, but I'll start utilizing my liver glycogen stores as well. If I'm exercising, an example the textbook gives you is that an hour of exercising at high intensity is going to lead to somewhere around 55% decrease in your glycogen storage. But at 2 hours of high intensity activity, so if I'm running for 2 hours, you pretty much run out of stored glycogen. So you've got to think about how long, how hard am I going for how long? If I'm only training for an hour, I probably do not need to supplement carbohydrate while I'm training. So if I'm going to ride my bike for an hour, or if I'm going to go run for an hour, then I shouldn't need to take carbohydrate. But if I'm going to run for 2 hours, if I'm going to do a marathon, if I'm doing a triathlon, if I'm going to play a football game that is 4 hours long, if I'm going to play volleyball where the games aren't very long but the entire session goes on, right? Any intermittent long duration, then I should be thinking about supplementing carbohydrate so that I don't fatigue quite so quickly. We want to delay fatigue for as long as we can. Fatigue is not I am tired. Fatigue is physiological, right? Fatigue is a physiological term. So I want to delay that for as long as possible so that I can perform at my highest level for as long as I can. I don't want to have to slow down if I don't have to. And obviously it's an important energy source for anaerobic exercise, so if I'm working out, doing interval training, if I'm doing resistance work, if I'm down in the max pack lifting weights or I'm over with LV lifting, then you're going to use a lot of carbohydrate during those training sessions. Unless you're doing a 1 rep max. But typically that's not training, right? That's an assessment. So when you're training, we need lots of carbohydrate if you're doing that kind of training on a regular basis. This graph just gives you an idea over time of how important then in maintaining your carbohydrate intake on a daily basis, because it's a limited store. It's not like fat, right? Even the leanest people have tons and tons of calories stored as fat. So I never am going to run out of calories if I'm exercising in a way that utilizes fat stores, unless I'm stuck up a mountain for 3 months. But carbohydrate, you have to, it's only a small amount of storage. So I have to replenish every day, otherwise over time we see a decrease in performance. Okay. So, training session 1, I train for 2 hours, I deplete my muscle glycogen, and this is a very high diet, 70%, that's really high. But if I eat lots of carbs, then the next day when I want to train again, my stored glycogen in my muscles is nice and high. I can have a good training session, deplete the store, fill up, and over several days, I don't see a drop in performance because I've maintained muscle glycogen. If, though, you don't eat very much carbohydrate, then what we see is we train, we deplete the store, we don't replenish the store very well because we don't eat enough carbohydrate. So then we get to day 2 and we really hit rock bottom And from here on out, training is getting very ugly, right? So you have those days where you get up and your legs feel nice and bouncy, right? And you feel like you can do anything when you get to the gym, where you go for your run. And then you have days where you wake up and your legs feel like concrete pillars and they weigh a ton and they don't want to do anything, right? Think back to what you ate the day before. If you trained hard the day before, what did you then eat? Because if you ate chicken and salad, you probably did not replace enough muscle glycogen to train really hard the next day. Right? Not that chicken and salad isn't great, but it needs a jacket potato with it, or a bowl of rice. Right? If you're an athlete, if you're training seriously. If you don't fuel it, you would not put water in your car. If you expect your car to run, you expect to fill it up with petrol, gas, right? So, if you expect your body to run, you can't fill it up with sugar and water. That's not how that works, okay? So you have to be sensible. You've got to use the discipline that you use in order to go to the gym and train every day, and apply it to your diet and your nutrition as well. It's not okay to say, well, I'm late back from training and I've got an essay to write and then I have to be at the gym at 5 o'clock in the morning, so I'm just going to eat a bag of chips while I'm writing my essay. It's not okay to get up for your 5 o'clock training session. The coaches know, because I tell them all the time, you should not be in the gym at 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay? Because you should not be going to the gym on an empty stomach. Period. Because if you don't eat anything, not only are you working on an empty stomach, but more importantly, your brain is running dry. Because your brain only works on glucose. So if your blood glucose is low, your stores of carbs are low, and then you go to the gym and you try and train, you may or may not have a decent training session physically, but you're more likely to get hurt because you're not concentrating properly. So, I know it's hard. I don't know the answer. Maybe the answer is a carb shake, because you can't eat at 5 o'clock in the morning. I don't know. Right? So, high carbohydrate diets. What are the pros and cons of high carbohydrate diets? For most athletes, or people who are exercising regularly, I need at least 50% carbohydrate, and some of us are going to need more depending upon what we're doing. All right? So, strength athletes, for example, at a point in their training cycle where they're doing a high volume of work, may need 55 to 60%. An endurance athlete, so a cyclist or a long distance runner who's doing a lot of miles on a regular basis, could need anywhere up to 65% of their diet to be carbohydrate. And the research clearly shows that if we have insufficient carbohydrate ingestion, right, if I don't take in enough to fuel what I'm trying to do, then we see several impacts, outcomes over time. I can't maintain training intensity and volume. So across the course of the week, I can't keep up the level of work that I was doing at the beginning of the week. Well, so it depends who I'm working with, right? If it's me, and I can't work as hard on Friday as I did on Monday, who cares? Right? I'm old and crinkly and crotchety, and all I'm doing is trying to keep one foot in front of the other without falling over. So really, if I can't work out that hard on Friday, what difference does it make? For you guys, consistent training is key to good performance. I can't have highs and lows in training during the week. You've got to have consistent training practice in order to play well. Every day's got to be a good day. Right? So I can't afford to have to drop off intensity at the end of the week. Now, some of that is down to your coach, because if they set the intensity too high early in the week, and then they expect you to maintain really high intensity all week, that's daft. But that's not under your control, right? But what you eat is under your control. So given a correct training program, are you going to tail off later in the week because you didn't eat right? Loss of muscle mass. So if I need extra calories and I'm not providing it, we might take some calories from muscle mass. More likely, I can't maintain muscle mass because my intensity and my volume of training go down. Right? So if I'm not looking at a week, but I'm looking at a 6 month, and I decide to not eat very much carbohydrate, then we could see impacts on muscle mass. And if I'm not training hard enough, then the adaptation that I was looking for might not happen. Right? Because the whole point of training is to get the adaptation, and if I'm not doing the training properly, then the adaptation's not going to occur. So most of your carbohydrates want to come from a complex source. So grains, vegetables, potatoes, rice. I want complex carbohydrate, because complex carbohydrate takes longer to digest. And because it takes longer to digest, then you get a slow trickle of glucose, monosaccharide, into your bloodstream. So you get a consistent blood glucose picture if you eat complex carbohydrates. So because the picture is consistent, if I'm at rest, then that carbohydrate is more likely to get put down as storage glycogen, which is what we want, because what we need, according to the data, is nice high muscle glycogen store at the beginning of every training session. If I take in simple carbohydrate, then the first problem with simple carbohydrates is they digest very quickly. So you get an immediate jolt of glucose into your bloodstream, because sodas, candies, some fruits have very high simple sugars. They jump into your bloodstream very, very quickly. And in response to a very quick spike in blood glucose, your body will release a ton of insulin, unless you're diabetic, right? Which is a different kettle of fish. But given a typical individual, the result will be a massive insulin spike, right? Insulin helps transfer glucose out of the bloodstream into the tissues. So you get a very quick spike, and then you get a really big drop the other side of the spike, because you shift all that glucose out of the bloodstream into the tissue. That's not so bad if you're training at that point, because you're going to use that glucose straight away for energy. So it may not be a massive problem if you do it in the middle of a training session or right before a training session. But over time, right, and if I do it at rest, that big spike in blood sugar and the big spike in insulin means I'm going to not use it for glycogen, I'm going to lay it down as fat. Because I've got all these extra calories bouncing around in the system that I can't use, and so we lay them down as stored fat. So there's all other kinds of health issues with soda. Try not to do soda very much, if at all. Okay? But it's really not a good plan for those of you that are trying to compete. So here's my big spike. Here's my big drop. If I do that right before training or during training, then time to exhaustion could be shorter. So I might run out of steam before the end of the training program. Depends a little bit on what else is going on in the picture, if you've got other glycogen available. Right? Trying to maintain a steady blood sugar situation is the best way. Means that your brain always has glucose available. How much sugar does your brain use every day? About 130 grams on average. Under exceptional circumstances, your brain doesn't use sugar, but most of the time, the only form of nutrition that your brain uses is glucose. So that's why I'm always saying don't come to class without having had lunch. If you don't have time for lunch, bring it with you to class. Because if you've been on the go all day and your blood sugar is dropping, chances of you hearing anything I'm saying are pretty minimal. Right? That's not helpful for you at all. It's not the best time of day to have class, 1 o'clock. White blood cells. What do we use white blood cells for? White blood cells help your immune system to fight infections. Only source of fuel they use, blood glucose. So if your glucose levels are consistently low, you're more likely for the white blood cells not to be able to fight an infection. Again, not a good plan if you're an athlete. So what we see here, and on this diagram, this one came out in the first edition of the textbook. They have corrected it in your edition of the textbook, because I checked. So it's round the wrong way on this particular diagram. Okay? This should be green down here. So, low carbohydrate diet, low muscle glycogen stores, time to exhaustion, not very long. Okay? High carbohydrate diet, very high muscle glycogen stores, time to exhaustion, a lot longer. Most of us are going to sit somewhere around here. Because not many of us need to carb load. Question. All right, in your textbook, they have a big section on glycemic index. You do see mention of glycemic index in the literature a little bit more these days. It was originally, or at least my first introduction to the idea of the glycemic index was through a friend who was diabetic, and the hospital had given her a booklet with the tables of what foods were counted as high, moderate, and low, and therefore what she should be aiming to eat in order to maintain her blood sugar a little bit more evenly. There's quite a lot of investigation into the idea of glycemic load for sports nutrition. The evidence looks a little confusing to me. I don't think that we're really clear, because a food that is decidedly low glycemic, like oatmeal, right? If you eat oatmeal for breakfast, then the evidence is that oatmeal digests very slowly and it drip feeds your bloodstream, and that's a very good plan across the morning and early afternoon. Right? But when you look at eating oatmeal in the evening, you don't see the same response. So there's a lot that we have to learn about glycemic index, because it seems to be dependent upon the individual, because the glycemic index is an individual response to taking in carbohydrate. So it's not the same for everybody anyway. And B, now if I have to account for the time of day that I'm eating this particular food, it complicates the picture quite a lot. All right? So I would say make sure that you have a look at that section of the chapter. Particularly if you are reading a lot about nutrition plans for athletes and carbohydrate drinks and things like that, because it's likely that you'll see the terms used in that section in the literature. But right now, I can't see it being a major player in the nutrition platform for a while. I don't think that what we know about it is consistent enough, is my personal opinion. It's really up and down. Things that are labeled high glycemic is anything, so they give foods a number out of 100, and it's your blood glucose response in comparison for over 2 hours when you eat that carbohydrate. So obviously that's highly individual, because everybody's going to respond differently. Things that are categorized as high glycemic are items that have a score of 70 or above. Some fruits, cornflakes, things that are quite high in simple sugars. Moderate is 56 to 69. So things that are sugary but maybe take a bit longer, like ice cream, because it has fat, although it has a lot of sugar in it. The time it takes for the sugar to get into the bloodstream is longer because it's got all this fat with it as well. Okay. And low glycemic foods are anything under 55 or under. So oatmeal, baked beans, whole milk. Right. Baked potatoes, you would think would be low. Most tables I've seen put them in moderate or high, which always seems odd to me. On the other hand, I don't know about you, but I never eat a baked potato, just a baked potato. It's got to have butter on it, or baked beans and cheese, or, right? So, again, anything where you put protein or fat into the picture increases absorption time. So it changes the picture. So, carbohydrate loading then is a strategy that we can use to maybe improve performance. But again, you've got to be clever about it because it depends what the performance is going to be as to whether or not it's relevant. Okay? Do I eat a high carb diet in order to increase endurance levels? So we do see an increase in performance for both untrained people and trained people in the appropriate event if we carb load. So it's good for both categories. The more trained you are, the less impact it's going to have. And what we're looking at is increasing glycogen load so that we can bump up our stores enough to maintain a higher race pace. So we use, at rest we're using fat. And as soon as we start moving, we start to use a little bit more carbohydrate. But I have to move at a pretty high intensity, 60–65% or higher, before I'm using mostly carbohydrate. So when I start to run, okay, from rest, take somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes of moving before we get back to using a lot of fat. So I'm going to use glycogen or glucose here. Then I'm going to use fat, depending on what pace I'm running at. Less fat if I'm a world marathon runner, because they don't run at 60%. They run at ridiculous speeds. They run a marathon faster than most of us can run 200 meters. Right? Over the entire marathon, they never slow up. It's insane, right? But for a normal person, I'm going to use some fat. And then we get to an intensity question. Right? At what point does running this race become hard enough that I need to use carbohydrate to finish the race? So, for a typical person, this could be length of the race. Right? So if I'm working for 3 hours, I'm working really hard now. If I'm going to keep going, and I need to use carbohydrate. Or if I've been trudging along and now I want to sprint in on the last mile, I need to switch back to carbohydrate if I'm going to up the speed that I'm running at, because that increases intensity. So now, what's going on here? Right? If my glycogen stores were low, I'll have used most of them getting halfway through the race. Right? Because remember here, this is not a 100% switch. I'm still using carbohydrate, I just start using more fat. So, if now I get to a point where I really can't use fat anymore, I can't break fat down fast enough to make ATP, and I need carbohydrate, here's my wall, right? Hitting the wall. I ran out of glycogen. So, carb loading is a strategy not for here, but for here, for the end of the race, for the end of the game, if the game's long enough. Because I want to be able to maintain my intensity, but that means I need carbohydrate. So carb loading allows me to almost almost double my carbohydrate store for some people. Okay? That means that when I get here, I've still got quite a lot of carbohydrate to finish the race. So I don't want to be the person who goes legless half a mile from the finish line. So carb loading used to be a 7-day event, and it was not very pleasant for some people. Okay? Take 7 days is a long time out from your competition in order to plan for this, and we're looking at 3 days of low carb diet. So there's a double whammy there. A, I've got a low carb diet, so I'm depleting my muscle glycogen, which means training doesn't feel very good right before the competition. That might not be a good plan, right? B, if it's a low carb diet, what am I eating a lot of? Proteins and fats, right? If I'm not eating very much carbohydrate, I must be eating either more protein or more fat or a combination. So for some individuals, that's not a good training diet, and it can cause gastrointestinal distress. So that's not a good plan either, right? And then we get to the last phase of the old version. We did 3 days of very high carbohydrate diet, but we don't do very much training at that point because we've completely emptied out all the store. What we want to do now is build the store back up. Well, do I want little or no training 3 days before a major competition? These days, that's not considered very good strategy, right? When I was a gymnast, we never trained at least the day before a competition, ever. That was just the accepted, you always took the day off before the competition. Some people took 2 or 3 days off. But nowadays, that's not really considered good training planning. So this old method isn't really used now. They modified it. There's several different versions available that modify so that we don't have these big swings in protein, fat, and carb intake, but we do have some three or 4 days of really high carbohydrates, but we don't have to cut down our training. And as I said, the results tell us that we see improved performance, improved endurance. So typically that is not that I am faster, dramatically at the end of the race, but that I'm able to maintain a slightly faster pace throughout the whole race, which then improves my time. Anything longer than an hour. So if I'm going less than an hour, there doesn't appear to be any help with carb loading. So again, intermittent sports, where the length of the game is long, although the individual plays are not very long, we see some improvement over time. Because again, it provides that fourth quarter in a 4-hour game, right? Does that ever happen? Yes? Okay, so fourth quarter, 4-hour game. Do I want to run out of steam? No, I want to be able to play that fourth quarter well. So there's literature to suggest that carb loading can help intermittent sports that have a long duration. No evidence, surprise, surprise. Why would there be no evidence that it helps anaerobic performance? Because I don't need to carb load for an anaerobic performance. It doesn't last 2 hours. If it's lasting 2 hours, it's not truly anaerobic. Okay.